She wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to survive. And the one thing standing between a billionaire's last breath and eternity was a maid earning $18.50 an hour who'd learned to throw a punch in a gym that smelled like ambition and old rubber. Nobody remembers the help. That's the first rule of working in a house like Westwood Estate. You move through rooms like furniture moves through light, present, functional, and thoroughly invisible. You refill glasses before they're empty. You remove plates before anyone notices they're done. You smile at the corners of your mouth, never the full thing, because a full smile from the help makes wealthy people uncomfortable in ways they can't articulate but will definitely hold against you. Yara Jones had mastered the art of invisibility in 11 days. She hadn't mastered caring about it. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and built with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years doing more with less money, less space, less grace from a world that handed those things out based on criteria Yara hadn't been consulted about. She'd grown up in Inglewood, California, raised by a grandmother who quoted scripture and threw a mean right hook and considered both equally sacred. She'd trained as a boxer for 5 years at a gym called The Corner, not because she dreamed of glory, but because hitting things with intention was the most honest therapy she'd ever found. She'd quit competing when her mother got sick. She hadn't quit the instincts. The instincts, it turned out, were not the kind of thing that punched out at the end of a shift. She had taken the job at Westwood Estate through a staffing agency called Premier Placement, which was the kind of name that made domestic work sound like it came with stock options. It did not come with stock options. It came with a green uniform, a white apron, sensible flats that looked like they were designed by someone who had never stood for 8 hours and $18.50 an hour, which, after the rent increase on her Inglewood apartment, was the difference between surviving and not. She was surviving. Barely. Proudly. The estate itself was the architectural equivalent of someone clearing their throat very loudly to get your attention. 14 bedrooms. Grounds so manicured they looked digitally rendered. A fountain in the center of the circular driveway shaped like some kind of mythological sea creature that none of the staff could name but everyone nodded at knowingly. A hedge maze in the East Garden that reportedly once lost a minor European royal for 45 minutes, which Yara privately felt was the most interesting thing about the whole property. And tonight the estate was dressed for performance. Park and Sue's annual charity gala had transformed the grounds into something from a film set. Fairy lights threaded through hedgerows. A string quartet played near the fountain with the polished exhaustion of people who had long ago made peace with their career choices. Catering tables stretched across the West Terrace, bearing food that was beautiful, miniature, and aggressively insufficient. 230 guests moved through the grounds in their diamonds and their certainties, radiating the specific confidence of people who had never once worried about a rent increase. Park and Sue stood at the center of it all like a man accustomed to being the gravitational point of any room he occupied. He was 35. Korean-born, Los Angeles assembled. He had the kind of face that photographers loved and rivals hated, composed, precise, calibrated. He wore a black suit that fit him the way architecture fits a skyline, like it had been specifically designed for that purpose and no other. He was holding a champagne flute with a gold rim, the special one, she knew, because she'd polished it herself that morning and nicked her thumb on a hairline chip she'd meant to flag to Pemberton. She'd meant to. Yara was moving through the West Terrace with a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres, 12 shrimp cocktails, 2 salmon blinis, and 1 miniature beef Wellington that had absolutely no business existing at that scale when she saw it. Gerald Pemberton, head butler, 19 years at the estate. Silver-haired, straight-backed, the kind of composed that most men practiced in mirrors for decades. He was standing approximately 4 feet from Park and Sue, and his right hand was moving with the very specific, very careful tension of a man doing something catastrophically wrong and trying to make it look like absolutely nothing. A small glassine fold. A tilt. A dissolution. For seconds. Yara used the first to confirm what she was seeing. She used the second to calculate the distance between herself and Park and Sue. 12 feet, marble flooring, 3 guests in between. She used the third to experience a brief, concentrated regret that there was no cleaner option available to her. She used the fourth to drop the entire tray, cover the 12 feet in 8 steps, and drive her right fist into the side of Park In-soo's jaw with the full rotational force of 5 years of training at a gym that smelled like ambition and old rubber. The sound was a crack. Sharp. Final. Like a starting pistol. Champagne erupted from the glass in a slow, almost cinematic arc. The flute detonated against the marble steps. The senator's wife in the cream Valentino gown received the full champagne impact and produced a sound that her finishing school had never prepared her for. 2 guests went down. One from genuine shock. One from a property developer in Malibu who'd been desperately searching for an exit from a conversation for 20 minutes and recognized his moment. Park In-soo hit the ground on one knee. Jaw throbbing. Pride in ruins. The estate went silent. Even the string quartet stopped. He looked up at Yara. This woman in the green uniform, chest heaving, knuckles already beginning to register what they'd done, and his expression cycled through shock, fury, confusion, and something that hadn't arrived at gratitude yet, but was clearly following the signs. "What?" he said, very quietly, in the specific tone of a man sorting through which lawyer to call first. "Was that?" Yara lowered her fist. "You're welcome," she said. It was the wrong thing to say. It was the only honest thing available. And in the stunned, glittering, champagne-soaked silence of the Westwood Estate Gala, with 230 witnesses and 3 cameras that had stopped filming the charity angle entirely, it was the sentence that changed everything. If you believe that doing the right thing should never cost you everything, comment, "I stand with Yara" below. Because what Park Ji-hwan tried to do in the shadows. Some people do that in broad daylight. Every day. Don't side with that. Hit like if you agree. Yara had exactly 30 seconds of silence before the world remembered how to be loud. It came back in waves. First the gasps, then the murmuring, then the full orchestral chaos of 230 wealthy people processing something their money had never prepared them for. Someone called for a doctor. Someone else called for their publicist, which said everything necessary about their priorities. The string quartet, bless them, attempted to resume playing, held it for exactly 4 bars, then collectively decided against it. Security arrived the way security always arrives when it's already too late. Fast, loud, and entirely focused on the wrong problem. 3 men in earpieces materialized around Yara, like she was the emergency. She supposed from their perspective she was. A maid had just punched the host of the most photographed charity event on the West Coast. In the face. In front of cameras. The optics were, to put it generously, complicated. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Check the champagne," Yara said. Her voice was steady. She was very deliberately not thinking about her knuckles, which were communicating their feelings about the evening's events in vivid, throbbing detail. The glass that shattered on the steps. Get the residue to a lab. And check your butler. The lead security officer, a broad man named Tate, who had the face of someone who had seen most things and preferred not to have, looked at her the way people look at someone speaking calmly in the middle of a fire. Like the calmness itself was suspicious. "Ma'am." "The butler," Yara repeated. Everyone looked at Gerald Pemberton. This was the moment, the precise, crystalline moment, that 19 years of professional composure met its absolute limit. Pemberton's face did something complicated. A kind of internal negotiation played out across his features, visible to anyone paying attention, which Yara was because Yara was always paying attention. Then he ran. It was genuinely the most shocking thing to happen all evening, including the punch, because Gerald Pemberton was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating the energy of a man who considered running beneath him on a fundamental, philosophical level. And yet there he was, coattails lifting, moving through the gala crowd with the desperate momentum of a man who had just watched his entire plan detonate on a marble terrace. He made it 6 steps. 6. Because on the 7th step, he ran directly into Dong-hyun, Park In-soo's personal assistant, 7 feet of quiet, unhurried efficiency, who caught Pemberton the way one catches a misdirected frisbee, with one hand, minimal effort, and a mildly disappointed expression that suggested this was not even close to the strangest Thursday he'd experienced in this job. The crowd erupted. The senator's wife, still champagne damp, grabbed the arm of the nearest person, and announced she needed to sit down immediately, which was reasonable. The property developer who had faked fainting earlier cracked one eye open to assess whether standing back up would cost him the attention he'd gained, decided the math wasn't favorable, and stayed down. Park In-soo was still on one knee. He was looking at Yara. She was looking back at him with the expression of someone who had done the correct thing and was now fully prepared to be punished for it, which was, he would think about later, in quieter moments, one of the most quietly devastating things he had ever witnessed. That readiness, that squared jaw, that absolute refusal to apologize for the right thing. His jaw throbbed magnificently. His pride throbbed worse. But somewhere beneath both of those things, something else was happening, something he hadn't felt in long enough that he almost didn't recognize it. It felt, uncomfortably, like being seen. Not admired. Not managed. Not handled. Seen. By a woman earning $18.50 an hour who had just thrown away the job, the reference, and probably a significant portion of her evening to save a life that she had no financial or social incentive whatsoever to save. He opened his mouth, closed it, stood up slowly, hand pressed to his jaw, and turned to Tate. "Get the lab on the phone," he said quietly. "And get me everything you have on Mr. Pemberton." Then he looked back at Yara, who was still standing precisely where she'd thrown the punch, feet planted, chin level, waiting for whatever consequence was coming with the patience of someone who had stopped fearing consequences a long time ago. "Don't go anywhere," he said. It wasn't a threat. It almost sounded like a request. Yara crossed her arms, looked around at the chaos, the toppled glasses, the trembling guests, Pemberton suspended 6 inches off the ground in Dong Hyun's grip, the senator's wife now accepting a replacement shawl from a junior staff member who looked like he was absolutely not paid enough for this, and then looked back at Park In-soo. "Where exactly," she said, "would I go?" The next 40 minutes were, by any reasonable measure, the most chaotic in Westwood Estate's 100-year history. And Westwood Estate had history. Real history. The kind engraved on small bronze plaques that nobody reads, but everybody respects. It had survived Prohibition, 2 divorces of historical proportions, a kitchen fire in 1987 that the staff still referenced in hushed tones, and the aforementioned European royal incident in the hedge maze. It had weathered storms, scandals, and one very regrettable New Year's party in 2019 that had resulted in a noise complaint from 3 zip codes simultaneously. None of that had prepared it for this. The senator's wife, whose name was Claudette Harrington, a fact she reminded people of approximately every 4 minutes, had now demanded 3 things in ascending order of absurdity: a fresh dress, a formal written apology from the champagne, and a car. She had received one of these. She left in it with the energy of a woman composing her memoir in real time, which she probably was. The property developer who had faked fainting, a man named Stewart who flipped luxury condos and occasionally the truth, had eventually stood up when he realized the cameras were now pointed exclusively at Pemberton and Yara, which was not the attention he'd performed for. He brushed off his tuxedo, accepted a canopy from a passing tray, and had the specific audacity to ask if there would be a second round of appetizers. There would not. The shattered champagne flute had been carefully collected by a forensics consultant who, it turned out, Park In-soo kept on retainer. A detail that raised several questions about Park's daily life that Yara filed away under things to think about later when she wasn't potentially being arrested. The lab results came back in 22 minutes, which was either impressive or alarming depending on how one felt about a billionaire having a private forensics consultant on speed dial at a charity gala. The compound identified was Eastern European in origin, sophisticated in construction, and specifically designed to metabolize fast enough to read as cardiac event on a standard autopsy. It was, the consultant explained to Tate in a low voice while Yara stood close enough to hear every word, the kind of poison that money buys and money buries. Tate looked at Yara. Yara looked at Tate. "Still think I'm the problem?" she asked. Tate had the decency to say nothing, which she respected. Pemberton, meanwhile, had been relocated to the estate's private study, a room lined with books that had clearly never been read, because the wealthy love the idea of books the way they love the idea of jogging, decoratively, and was now seated across from two of Park's legal team and making sounds like a man whose conscience had been waiting 19 years for a decent exit. The name came out within minutes.
Park Ji-hwan.
And here was where the evening introduced its second act twist, because Park Ji-hwan was not, as one might assume after a villain reveal, safely elsewhere. He was not in a car. He was not at an airport. He was not doing anything so sensible or cinematic as fleeing. He was standing in the third row of the remaining gala guests, holding his champagne glass, watching everything unravel with the expression of a man trying very hard to look like a bystander while internally experiencing something close to a complete system shutdown. He was 41, lean, sharp-featured, and possessed of the specific handsomeness that comes in second place, which, Yara would learn later, had been the defining injury of his entire existence. Second most handsome. Second in the inheritance. Second in the board vote. 3 years running. Second in a family that only remembered first. Some men process being second by working harder. Park Ji-hwan had processed it by hiring Pemberton. When security turned toward him, all 3 earpieces swiveling with the synchronized energy of a boy band hitting their mark, Ji-hwan did something nobody anticipated. He smiled. Not the desperate smile of a cornered man. Not the collapsed smile of someone whose plan had failed. A slow, composed, deliberate smile. The kind that suggested the evening was not proceeding the way anyone thought it was proceeding, including the people who thought they'd already won. Then he raised his champagne glass in a small, private toast. To no one. To everyone. To Yara, specifically, who was watching him with narrowed eyes and the dawning, cold recognition that this wasn't over. That the real danger hadn't started yet. That somewhere between Pemberton's confession and Ji-hwan's theatrical composure, she had missed something. She just didn't know what.
Yet.
Dong-hyun moved toward Ji-hwan with the calm inevitability of weather. Ji-hwan set his glass down on a passing tray, neatly, without spilling a drop, the way a man does when he has practiced leaving things behind, and allowed himself to be escorted toward the east corridor without resistance, without argument, and without the expression of a man who believed he was losing. Yara watched him go. Her knuckles throbbed. Her instincts, which had been right once tonight and had no intention of retiring, throbbed harder. "I need to follow them," she said to no one in particular. "You need to stay here," said Tate. Said Yara, in the tone of someone who had heard that and was choosing not to be limited by it. She set down her remaining tray for canapés, one of which she ate first because she had been on her feet for 6 hours and she was not going to face the next crisis on an empty stomach, straightened her apron, and walked toward the east corridor with the quiet, purposeful energy of a woman who had decided that the evening wasn't done with her yet. She was right. It absolutely was not. The east corridor of Westwood Estate was the kind of hallway that existed purely to make people feel small. 30 feet long, 12 feet high, lined with oil portraits of people who had never worked a day in their lives but looked tremendously serious about it. The lighting was the warm, amber sort that cost more per fixture than Yara's monthly groceries. The carpet was so thick it absorbed footsteps entirely, which was either luxurious or ominous depending on whether you were being followed. Tonight it was both. Yara moved through it quietly, which was not difficult. 11 days of professional invisibility had made her exceptionally good at occupying space without announcing it. She could cross a room carrying crystal and silver and arrive at the other end without a single soul having registered her passage. It was, she had decided, the one genuinely transferable skill this job had given her. That and an intimate knowledge of which doors in this estate locked from which side. She had memorized that on day 3. The security officer who had waved her toward the east corridor had introduced himself as Officer Reeves and explained, with the specific rehearsed warmth of someone trained in de-escalation, that she needed to give her formal statement in the private receiving room at the corridor's end. Standard procedure. Completely routine. He'd smiled the entire time he said it. He was smiling very hard. Yara's grandmother's voice arrived in her head with the punctuality of a woman who had never once been late for anything. Never walk anywhere with a stranger who's smiling too hard, baby. Smiling costs nothing. That's exactly why you should charge for it. Yara kept walking, kept her face neutral, counted her steps and calculated, with the quiet mathematical efficiency of someone who had spent years reading bodies in a boxing ring, exactly what was wrong with this picture. Officer Reeves was walking slightly too close. His right hand hadn't moved from his jacket pocket since they'd entered the corridor. And his earpiece, she'd clocked it immediately, was a different model from the ones Tate's team wore. Subtle. Expensive. The kind of subtle that costs money specifically to look cheap. He wasn't Park's security. He was Ji Hwan's. They reached a door, heavy oak brass handle, and Reeves moved to open it with his left hand, which meant his right was staying in that pocket, which meant Yara stopped walking. "You know what?" she said pleasantly. "I left my phone on the terrace. I should really go back and—" He stepped in front of her. The smile was gone. The door behind her clicked. A second man, she realized, which meant they'd been coordinated, which meant Ji Hwan had planned for exactly this contingency, which meant Ji Hwan was considerably smarter than a man who'd just been publicly escorted away from his own failed assassination attempt had any right to be. Yara had approximately 2 seconds. She used them the way she used most things, efficiently, and without ceremony. The first one is stepping inside Reeves' reach, which is the one thing people who aren't trained fighters never expect, because instinct says move away from danger, and training says move through it. The second went to the wrist, his right wrist, the one connected to whatever was in that pocket, applied with the specific rotational pressure that her old coach, a 60-year-old Trinidadian man named Winston who smelled of liniment and philosophy, had drilled into her approximately 800 times. The crack was not loud. Reeves' sound, however, was extremely loud. He went down sideways, which knocked a portrait off the wall, a large oil painting of someone's very serious grandfather, and it landed face up on the carpet, staring at the ceiling with the dignified resignation of a man who had seen everything and was done commenting on it. Yara felt that on a spiritual level. The second man, broader, slower, the kind of large that confuses itself with invincible, came through the door with the momentum of someone who had not processed that the situation had already changed. Yara moved left. He went right. She used his own forward momentum the way water uses gravity, not fighting it, just redirecting it, and he met the corridor wall with the full conviction of a man who had made several poor decisions rapidly. He slid down it slowly, also dignified. In its way. Yara straightened her apron, looked at the two men on the floor, looked at the portrait of the serious grandfather, which was now tilted at a rakish angle that substantially improved his personality. Looked at her apron strings, white, cotton, surprisingly robust, and made a practical assessment. She zip-tied Reeves to the corridor radiator using the apron strings with the focused efficiency of a woman who had not come this far to leave loose ends. His phone she took. His earpiece she removed and pocketed. She'd give it to Tate's team as evidence, because she was helpful like that. The second man she zip-tied to the door handle using her spare hair tie and the belt from Reeves' own jacket, which felt both resourceful and poetically appropriate. She used Reeves' shattered phone emergency function, still operational, to contact Tate. "East Corridor," she said when he picked up. "2 of Ji Hwan's people. They're zip-tied. You're welcome." A pause. "With what?"
Tate said.
"Apron strings and a hair tie." Another pause. Longer. "I'm coming to the East Corridor," said Tate. "Bring someone to carry the portrait," Yara said. It fell off the wall. The grandfather deserves better. She hung up, stood in the amberlit corridor, breathing steadily, knuckles making their feelings known for the second time that evening. Somewhere deeper in the estate, she could hear voices, Park's legal team, Ji Hwan's controlled composure presumably beginning its first real cracks, the distant administrative machinery of consequence finally catching up to money. She thought about Biscuit, her cat, about the jollof rice getting cold at home, about how all she'd wanted was to get through a shift. She almost laughed. Almost. By midnight, Westwood Estate had completed its transformation from the West Coast's most glamorous charity gala into the world's most expensive crime scene. The guests were gone. The fairy lights were still on, because nobody had thought to turn them off, which gave the police tape a festive quality that felt deeply inappropriate and somehow very Los Angeles. The string quartet had packed up at 9, though one violinist had lingered until 10:15, apparently hoping the situation would resolve itself into something he could describe at dinner parties without being disbelieved. It would not resolve into that. It would resolve into something considerably better. Park Ji-hwan had lasted exactly 40 minutes under formal questioning before his composure, that expensive, practiced, generational composure, developed its first visible crack. Then its second. Then, with the structural integrity of a dam that had been leaking privately for years, it simply gave way entirely, and everything came out in one exhausting, comprehensive flood. The wire transfers. The compound source. The 3 previous attempts that hadn't made it past planning. The promise to Pemberton of a Swiss account and early retirement, which Pemberton had apparently believed despite every available piece of evidence suggesting Ji-hwan honored promises the way cats honor Mondays, which is to say, not at all. Pemberton, for his part, had already said everything twice, and was now on his third telling with the enthusiastic thoroughness of a man who had discovered confession felt better than he'd expected and intended to extract maximum value from the experience. Ji-hwan was escorted out at 11:43 in handcuffs that caught the fairy lights as he passed. Even leaving, he managed to look expensive. Some people, Yara thought, watching from the doorway, were simply built for aesthetics regardless of circumstance. It was annoying. She respected it slightly despite herself. Then she stopped respecting it because he'd tried to murder someone, which was a fairly firm ceiling on her admiration. Park and Sue found her in the kitchen. Not the catering kitchen, the real kitchen, the one the staff used, smaller and warmer and smelling of coffee that someone had brewed at some point and forgotten about. Yara was sitting on a counter, not a chair, the counter, because she had been professionally invisible for 11 days and had decided that era was over, with a bag of frozen peas applied to her right hand and a plate of Park's expensive biscuits that she was working through with systematic commitment. She had not asked about the biscuits. She had simply found them, assessed them as excellent, and proceeded. Park and Sue stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. This woman in the green uniform with one apron string missing, frozen peas on her knuckles, biscuit in her mouth, sitting on his counter with the energy of someone who had entirely stopped performing for anyone's benefit, including his. Something in his chest did something inconvenient. He ignored it, pulled out the stool across from her, and sat down. "You tied a man to my radiator," he said. "2 men," Yara corrected. "The radiator and a door handle. I had limited resources." "With apron strings. And a hair tie."
Don't undersell the hair tie.
That was structural. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, red and blue police lights moved across the manicured lawn in slow, rhythmic sweeps, painting the hedge maze in alternating colors. The hedge maze, Yara noted, looked significantly more sinister under police lighting. She'd been right about that from day one. Pemberton confessed everything, Park said quietly. "I know. Ji-hwan is in custody. I know that too. My entire security team missed a poisoning that a maid caught with her eyes and stopped with her fist." Yara took a dignified bite of biscuit. "Your security team is very good at earpieces," she offered generously. "The earpieces are excellent. Very convincing." Park and Sue did something she hadn't seen him do once in 11 days of observation.
He laughed.
Not the polished, social laugh he deployed at galas, the real one. Sudden and unguarded, the kind that escapes before the person it belongs to can edit it. It transformed his face entirely, the precision dissolving briefly into something human and unscheduled, and Yara thought that this version, was the one that actually lived behind the suits and the hot sauce empire and the careful architecture of a man who had spent years trusting no one. She filed that away too. "I'm giving you a raise," he said, recovering. "I'm your head of security now," she corrected pleasantly. "The position is non-negotiable. The previous occupant missed a poisoning. I caught it with my face and my fist. The math is simple. You caught it with his face." Semantics. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a police radio crackled something procedural. Somewhere in the estate's east wing, Tate was presumably filing a report that would require several attachments and at least one diagram.
"Triple salary," Park said.
full benefits. And you get an actual office, not a broom closet. I want it in writing. My lawyer is still on the premises. Convenient. Also, he added, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided to say something true and was slightly annoyed about it. Thank you. For all of it. The punch. The corridor. He gestured vaguely. Apron string engineering. Yara considered him. The jaw sheet hit, which had developed a spectacular bruise, deep purple fading to gold at the edges, the kind of bruise that told a complete story. The loosened tie, the first honest expression she'd seen on his face in 11 days of watching him perform himself for other people. You're welcome, she said. Then, because she was Yara Jones and she had never once in her life left well enough alone, and get rid of the hedge maze. He blinked. The hedge maze. Someone is going to get murdered in there, and it won't be an accident. I've thought this since day one. It has murder geometry. Murder geometry, the angles. The sight lines. The fact that it swallowed a European royal for 45 minutes and nobody thought that was a warning. She finished the last biscuit. Get rid of it. Put a tennis court there. Something with visibility. Park and Sue, billionaire, survivor, briefly airborne, owner of 3 companies and one inexplicably successful hot sauce brand, looked at the woman sitting on his kitchen counter eating his biscuits and dismantling his landscaping choices with the calm authority of someone who had just single-handedly saved his life, neutralized 2 operatives, and revolutionized his security infrastructure using haberdashery. He picked up his phone, called his lawyer. 2 things, he said. Draft an employment contract for Yara Jones, head of security, triple the previous salary, full benefits, a real office. And call the landscaping company. The hedge maze goes. He hung up. Yara nodded slowly, satisfied in the way that people are satisfied when the universe briefly behaves itself. Also, she said, sliding off the counter and collecting her frozen peas with dignity, I need tomorrow morning off. You just became my head of security. And my cat needs the expensive food. He's been alone since 4 p.m. and he holds grudges. She paused at the kitchen door. His name is Biscuit, by the way. Park and Sue looked at the now empty plate, looked at the door. Of course it is, he said. Yara Jones walked out of that kitchen, no tray, no apron strings, no invisibility, and into a life that had just rewritten itself entirely, one punch at a time. Biscuit was getting the expensive food. She'd earned that too. If you believe that the right person always ends up exactly where they're supposed to be, no matter what uniform they're wearing when they get there, comment, Yara deserved it all below. And if you can't stand people like Park Ji-hwan who use shadows to take what they could never earn, hit like, hit subscribe, and know that trolls, cowards, and people who root for the villain definitely won't. The rest of us? We're Team Yara. Always.